It is the final hour of a long, fractured life, inside a breathless room in the foreign land of Goshen, where an old man, blind with age, pulls himself up on his bed to gather his 12 sons. He summons them not just to give a dying father's blessing, but to explicitly reveal the precise timeline of the end of the world. He makes the promise out loud, and then, abruptly, he breaks it. Picture it. The 12 brothers stand in a circle around the patriarch Israel, leaning into the heat of the room to hear the final secrets of human history. They are waiting for the curtain of time to be pulled back. Instead, Jacob begins speaking in cryptic, violent animal omens. The prophet gathered his children to declare the end of days, but a sudden veil fell over his mind and forced him to bury the identity of the ultimate adversary inside a bizarre riddle about a snake. Genesis 49. 1 inch, the King James Version, sets the stage with absolute clarity. And Jacob called unto his sons, and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Stop right there. The invitation is not a metaphor. He intends to speak of the Acharet, the Hebrew word for the latter end, the absolute final curtain of the age. But read the rest of the chapter. The grand timeline of the end never comes. The apocalyptic revelation splinters into a strange menagerie of lions, donkeys, ships, and wolves. Sit with that. Why would the canonical text announce a revelation of the final days and then actively refuse to deliver it? To understand the silence, we have to look outside our standard translations to a text that remembers the unseen spiritual warfare raging in that room. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an ancient Aramaic translation and expansion of the Torah, records the exact moment the atmosphere broke. According to this ancient Jewish record, the dying patriarch actually saw the full chronological sequence of the world. He saw the exact hour the Messiah would arrive, and he saw the shadow of the final adversary rising to meet him. And just as he opened his mouth to name that dark prince, the vision was ripped away. The Holy Spirit departed from him. See the scene. An old man, suddenly stripped of the divine light, grasping in the dark for a way to warn his sons about an apocalyptic threat he was no longer permitted to speak of plainly. He could not give them the timeline, but he could leave them a physical clue. He had to weave the warning into the fabric of a tribal blessing, burying the adversary's nature inside the name of one specific son. He looked at the boy standing in the room, the one who would carry the authority of judgment for the camp, and assigned him a terrifying object. A horned viper, coiled silently in the dust, waiting to strike the heel of a horse. The snake in this chapter is not just poetic imagery, it is a locked door left behind by a prophet whose mouth was shut by heaven. Jacob promised an ending, but he left behind a viper waiting on a desert road. The text leaves us trapped in the room with a broken prophecy, forcing us to ask what he saw just before the lights went out. Which son inherited the serpent? Look at the specific syllables falling from Jacob's mouth in the opening verse of the chapter. He does not say, I will tell you what happens tomorrow, or I will tell you your children's destiny. He uses a very specific, heavily weighted Hebrew word, akarit, translated in the King James as the last days. Stop right there. In biblical Hebrew, akarit does not mean a vague, distant future or the natural end of a human lifespan. It points to the absolute terminus, the final sequencing of earthly time. Jacob is preparing to map out the eschaton. He is preparing to name the exact hour. Watch what the text does. The canonical Bible moves from this massive apocalyptic promise in verse 1 immediately into poetic blessings about Reuben's instability and Simeon's anger. The timeline simply vanishes. But the ancient rabbis who preserved the Aramaic paraphrases recorded a terrifying pause between the first and second verse. The Targum explicitly states that as soon as the word Akarit left his lips, the Shekinah glory, the divine light of prophetic revelation, instantly evaporated from the room. Jacob's mind went completely black. I hold this, as they're telling, not as proven fact, yet it answers a glaring structural void in the biblical text that scholars have wrestled with for centuries. The patriarch promised the end of the world, and heaven suddenly gagged him. Same room, different atmosphere. In that suffocating tent in Goshen, surrounded by the smell of dying breath and desert dust, Israel realized he had been censored by the Almighty. He was looking right at the sons who would become the 12 tribes of the earth. According to the ancient tradition, he saw the exact arrival of the Messiah, but standing directly in the path of that redemption, he also saw the final adversary, the ultimate architect of destruction. God sealed the timeline, but Jacob refused to let his sons walk out of that room unwarned. If he could not give them the clock, he would give them a mirror. He had to hide the identity of the enemy in plain sight. See the scene. He looked around the circle of men, searching for the bloodline where this final darkness would eventually anchor itself. His blind eyes passed over Judah. They passed over Levi. They settled squarely on Dan, the fifth son, the firstborn of Rachel's handmaid. Genesis 49. 16 inches, the King James anchors the pivot. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Read that again. On the surface, it sounds like an honor. The Hebrew root of the name Dan literally translates to judge. He is declaring that this tribe will carry authority, that they will weigh the scales for the camp. You expect a father to follow up a title like that with a promise of wisdom or a scepter of righteousness, but Jacob does not do that. He takes the noble title of judge and immediately pairs it with a creature of absolute venomous chaos. The prophet strips the crown from Dan's head and replaces it with a curse. He introduces a physical object so specific, so dangerous, that it completely rewrites the destiny of this son. The veil dropped over the room, hiding the timeline but leaving behind a terrifying inheritance. The prophet took the promised authority of the judge and bound it to a shadow on the path. What exactly was waiting for the fifth son in the dust? Genesis 49-17 drops the hammer on the atmosphere of the room. Dan shall be a serpent, by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. Stop right there. Jacob is not handing out generic poetry. The King James uses the word adder, a familiar English term for a poisonous snake, but peel back the translation to the ancient Hebrew underneath, and you do not find a common field snake. You find a highly specific, rare word used nowhere else in the entire Torah: shephithon. Picture it. The shephithon is the Saharan horned viper, a creature engineered purely for the ambush. It does not slither openly across the rocks. It does not hunt in the daylight. It buries itself entirely beneath the loose sand of the desert trade routes, leaving only two jagged, horn-like scales protruding above the surface. It waits in absolute silence for the vibration of a heavy hoof. Reading, not inventing, Jacob binds the eternal destiny of his son to an assassin in the dust. Judah gets the lion, tearing its prey in the open with regal authority. Dan gets the horned viper, striking from total concealment. The patriarch strips away the honor of the judge and replaces it with the ultimate symbol of hidden, venomous chaos. Sit with that. A father on his deathbed looks at his fifth son and says, "Your bloodline will be the terror of the path." If the ancient Aramaic Targum is right, if Jacob was originally trying to map out the absolute end of days before heaven silenced his tongue, then this horned viper is not just a military tactic for a future border war. This snake is an eschatological marker. It is a signpost pointing directly to the final adversary. This is one reading, not the final word. But watch what the text does. The verse explicitly states the mechanism of the strike that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. The target of the Shephaphon is not the horse itself. The target is the rider, the authority structure, the one holding the reins. The viper strikes the lowest possible point, the heel, in order to bring down the highest throne. See the scene. Jacob is tracing a spiritual DNA sequence for his sons. He is warning the rest of the brothers that when the final curtain falls on human history, the ultimate venom will not come from a foreign, invading empire. It will come from inside the camp. The threat is domestic. The architect of the final fall will rise from their own 12 tribes. The Shephaphon waits by the path, buried in the sand. But out of 12 gathered men, why does Dan inherit the serpent's curse? To answer that, we have to look at an ancient record that remembers exactly how the fifth son opened the door to the dark. The patriarch looked at his son and prophesied a hidden viper designed to bring down the rider in the last days. But the desert caves of Qumran hold a much darker record of how this specific bloodline earned the serpent's mark. What exactly did the tribe of Dan agree to in the dark? Fast forward from the breathless tent in Goshen to the bone-dry limestone cliffs overlooking the lowest point on earth. The Dead Sea Scrolls, sealed in jars in the caves of Qumran 2,000 years ago, held fragments of a text that the Western world had almost entirely forgotten. Among the shattered pottery and brittle parchment pulled from the dust was a record that perfectly mirrors the room we just left. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. According to this ancient Jewish text, years after Jacob's death, the 12 brothers each faced their own final moments. Dan, the fifth son, gathered his own children around his bed, but he did not give them a father's blessing. He gave them a terrifying confession. Picture it. The old patriarch, the one who inherited the curse of the horned viper, looks into the eyes of his descendants and warns them of a dark spiritual contract he made in his youth. The Testament of Dan records his admission that he allowed his mind to be entirely overtaken by the spirits of deceit. He confesses to a direct, willing allegiance with an entity he names as Beliar, an ancient title for the Prince of Darkness. He admits to his children that it was Beliar who originally filled him with murderous rage against his brother Joseph, blinding his eyes to justice and poisoning his bloodline. I offer it as that, one tradition's record. But watch what the text does when you lay it firmly beside our canonical Bible. Genesis 49, 17 inches. The King James anchors the scene. Dan shall be a serpent, by the way, an adder in the path. Stop right there. A viper does not conquer with blunt military force. It conquers with venom. In the ancient Near East, venom was universally understood as the physical manifestation of a lie. It is a hidden poison that corrupts from the inside out. Dan's deathbed confession in the Qumran fragments is that his tribe's defining sin is exactly this, the poison of deception. He tells his children that Beliar has taken up permanent residence within their tribal borders, whispering in the dark. The son who was named to be the judge of Israel traded the scales of justice for the venom of the adversary. Sit with that. Jacob did not assign the snake to Dan by random poetic inspiration. He saw the spiritual door his son had already opened. The Shephaphon buried in the sand was not just a future military strategy. It was a present spiritual reality. Dan invited the dark in, and the entity that walked through that door was not interested in a temporary alliance. Beliar was planting a seed for the Acharit, the last days. The final architect of destruction needed a landing pad inside the camp of God, a bloodline willing to harbor the serpent's nature until the absolute end of time. The fifth son realized too late that he was not the master of his own destiny. He was the instrument of a much older predator. 2 deathbeds, 2 visions, 1 venom. A dying prophet saw the viper, and a dying son confessed to the dark. The hidden venom of the adversary is now officially woven into the timeline of the 12 tribes. But to understand the precise mechanism of this hidden snake, we have to look closely at the anatomy of its strike. What happens when a father's dying prophecy borrows its exact phrasing from the oldest curse in the world? Look closely at the anatomy of the strike in Genesis 49. The horned viper does not strike the horse in the chest. It does not ambush the rider from the high branches of a tree. The King James tells us precisely how the attack unfolds. The adder biteth the horse heels. Stop right there. In the ancient world of chariots and cavalry, military strikes were aimed at the mass of the animal or the heart of the man. But Jacob narrows the entire prophetic focus down to the lowest, most vulnerable fraction of bone and tendon in the dust. The heel. The Hebrew word anchoring this verse is akeb. It is a highly specific anatomical target. And for a biblical patriarch whose own birth name, Yaakov, literally translates to heel catcher, this exact word carries an immense, undeniable weight in that breathless room. Read that again. But Jacob is not referencing his own birth. He is not making a pun about his past. He is deliberately pulling a thread from a much older, much darker narrative. To understand the terrifying gravity of what is happening on this deathbed, you have to rewind the tape. Go all the way back to the very beginning of the Torah, past the flood, past the fall of the Watchers. Stop at the closed gates of Eden. Picture it. The original rebellion has just fractured the perfection of creation. The Almighty stands in the garden, passing absolute judgment on the ancient serpent who orchestrated the ruin. Genesis 3. 15 inches, the King James anchors the curse. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Same target, same anatomy, the exact same Hebrew word. Akib, the heel. Jacob is intentionally mapping the ancient curse of Eden directly onto the bloodline of his 5th son. I hold this as one reading, not the final word. But you cannot ignore the architectural design of the Hebrew text. The dying prophet is looking at Dan and delivering a devastating revelation. He is saying, the ancient war between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, you are the tribe that carries the venom. Watch what the text does. The Shephaphon in the sand is not just a biological snake, and it is not just a metaphor for a future border skirmish. It is the spiritual successor to the Nahash, the shining deceiver of the garden. By striking the heel, the viper triggers a catastrophic collapse. The verse says, so that his rider shall fall backward. The ultimate target of the snake is never the animal. The target is the authority structure. The Antichrist spirit does not just want to wound a horse. It wants to violently unseat the rider who brings deliverance. Sit with that. This was the apocalyptic terror that fell over Jacob when the vision of the timeline was abruptly taken from him. He realized the final enemy was not waiting outside the walls in some distant empire. The enemy was standing right there at the family table. The venom of the garden had survived the flood, bypassed the altar, and taken up quiet, legal residence inside the tribe of the judge. The shadow of Beliar was already breathing in the room. The patriarch had successfully buried the identity of the final adversary inside the image of the horned viper, linking it forever to the ancient curse of Eden. But a deathbed prophecy is only a shadow until it steps into the brutal light of historical reality. Centuries after the old man was buried in the cave of Machpelah, the 12 tribes finally marched out of the wilderness to claim the promised land. And the tribe of Dan did exactly what their dying father said they would do. The serpent was no longer just cryptic poetry on a dying man's lips. It became a physical infestation that permanently breached the borders of Israel. The canonical books of Judges and Kings record the exact moment the venom finally struck the heel, plunging the northern kingdom into a catastrophic spiritual ruin. What physical objects did the tribe of the viper drag into the promised land? 600 men, armed with weapons of war, marched north through the hill country of Ephraim, carrying a stolen silver idol in their hands. They have left their original coastal allotment behind, searching for a softer target, driving their women and children toward a quiet, unsuspecting city at the absolute northern edge of the map. They are moving toward the shadow of Mount Hermon. The tribe of the viper is finally claiming its ground. But they are not bringing the God of Abraham with them. They are bringing a permanent, metallic infection. Judges 18. 30 inches, the King James records the catastrophic shift, and the children of Dan set up the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. Stop right there. This is not a minor infraction. This is the first officially sanctioned tribal-wide system of idolatry in the Promised Land. The son who was named to be the judge of Israel has officially established a rival priesthood. The venom of Belial, prophesied in the breathless tent in Goshen, is no longer a hidden spiritual abstraction. It is a physical altar of stolen silver breathing in the northern air. See the scene. The Shephiphan has officially buried itself in the dust of the northern border. It is no coincidence where they settled. Mount Hermon is the exact geographical coordinate where First Enoch, an ancient Jewish writing preserved whole in the Ethiopian Bible, says the rebellious Watchers originally descended to corrupt humanity. The tribe of Dan planted their flag at ground zero of the ancient angelic rebellion. They aligned their territory with the very gateway of the dark. The Testament of Dan warned that the Prince of Darkness would use this exact tribe to introduce a devastating rebellion, and canonical history confirms it point for point. They struck the heel of the nation, and the rider, the spiritual authority of Israel, began to violently fall backward. Same venom, same result, but the infection did not stop in the days of the judges. Centuries later, when the kingdom of Israel fractured into two, a wicked king named Jeroboam needed a way to keep his people from traveling south to worship at the true temple in Jerusalem. He needed a counterfeit, so he forged two massive golden calves. He placed one in Bethel, and he placed the other in the far north. 1 Kings 12:29 tells us exactly where the second calf went, and the other put he in Dan. Sit with that. Whenever the adversary needed a physical beachhead in the Promised Land, he always went back to the fifth son. He went back to the territory of the viper. Dan was the open door. They harbored the ancient venom of the garden, actively poisoning the spiritual bloodline of the 12 tribes from the high places of Hermon. I offer this as one reading, a careful tracking of the canonical narrative through the lens of ancient Jewish expectation. But the historical reality is undeniable. The tribe of Dan traded their royal inheritance for a counterfeit god. They became the conduit for the exact apocalyptic threat their father was forbidden from naming out loud. The dying patriarch in Genesis 49 saw all of this coming. He saw the stolen silver of judges. He saw the golden calves of kings. He saw the shadow of Belial taking permanent residence in the north, anchoring itself for the final days. And that overwhelming vision of absolute ruin is exactly why Jacob does something completely unprecedented in the very next breath of his prophecy. The tribe of the viper had become the geographical and spiritual epicenter of Israel's idolatry, fulfilling the darkest edges of the deathbed warning. But back in the tent in Goshen, The sheer weight of this prophetic foresight physically breaks the patriarch mid-sentence. What forced a dying prophet to abandon his poetry and scream directly into the heavens? Go back into the breathless room in Goshen. The patriarch has just spoken the word Shephithon into the heavy air. The ancient venom of Eden has been assigned to the fifth son, and the sheer weight of this terrifying realization physically breaks him. The entire literary rhythm of Genesis 49 shatters in a single breath. Genesis 49, 18 inches. The King James reads, "I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord." Stop right there. Look at the structure of the chapter. For 17 verses, Jacob has been speaking horizontally. He addresses Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Issachar, and Dan. He is talking directly to the men standing around his bed. But suddenly, immediately after predicting the serpent's ambush, he stops. He breaks the fourth wall of his own deathbed prophecy. He turns his blind eyes away from his sons and speaks vertically. See the scene. He is staring into the dark apocalyptic future of the fifth son. He is watching the horned viper strike the heel and violently bring down the rider, and the overwhelming terror of that vision forces an exhausted old man to interrupt his own final words just to scream into the heavens. But the English translation hides the most stunning revelation of the room. Look at the Hebrew word Jacob uses for salvation. He does not use a generic term for rescue or temporary military victory. The word on his lips is Yeshua. Read that again. Thousands of years before the angel Gabriel visited Nazareth, Jacob is lying on his deathbed, looking straight at the apocalyptic shadow of the adversary rising from the tribe of Dan. He knows the curse of Eden requires a very specific remedy. The serpent strikes the heel, but only the promised seed of the woman can crush the head. And so he cries out, "I have waited for your Yeshua, O Yahweh." He is invoking the literal name of the Messiah. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan recorded this exact spiritual calculus. According to the ancient Aramaic paraphrase, when Jacob looked down the timeline of the tribe of Dan, he saw their greatest human champion, Samson. But he saw that Samson would ultimately be blinded and crushed beneath the rubble of a pagan temple. He saw that human judges could not stop the ancient venom. The patriarch realized that no earthly military leader could cure the infection of Beliar. I hold this as their telling, not as proven fact. But watch what the canonical text does. It places the ultimate cry for deliverance immediately after the ultimate prophecy of deception. The horned viper demands the Yeshua. Sit with that. Jacob breathes out this prayer, gathers whatever physical strength he has left, and finishes the blessings for the rest of his sons. The room goes quiet. The patriarch dies. The sons carry his bones out of Egypt and back to the caves of Canaan. Centuries turn to dust. The empires of the earth rise and burn. The Bible closes its historical books and opens its final prophetic apocalypse. Jacob named the venom, but the story of the fifth son is not over, because when the curtain finally falls on human history, the disciple John is handed a census of the tribes that survive the end of the world. What happens when you read the final roll call of heaven and look for the name of the viper? Go back now to the room where this film began. The suffocating heat of Goshen, the old man blind with age, the 12 sons standing in a circle, waiting for the timeline of the end of the world. You have read Genesis 49 100 times. But tonight, the broken prophecy is no longer a puzzle. You know why the veil dropped. You know why heaven suddenly silenced the patriarch. He had to bury the identity of the final adversary inside a riddle, because the architect of that ruin was standing right next to his bed. The patriarch breathed the word Shephithon. He warned the camp that the fifth son would harbor the venom of the ancient serpent, striking the heel of the authority structure to bring the rider down. And for thousands of years, through the stolen silver of judges and the golden calves of kings, the tribe of Dan fulfilled every dark syllable. But the ultimate proof of this terrifying inheritance does not happen in the Old Testament. It happens at the absolute end of the age. It happens in the exact accurate timeline Jacob was originally trying to map out. Picture it. The disciple John is standing on the Isle of Patmos, receiving the final apocalyptic visions of the canonical Bible. Revelation chapter 7 opens with 4 angels holding back the 4 winds of the earth, waiting to seal the servants of God. The census is called. The 144,000 are sealed, 12,000 from Judah, 12,000 from Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin. Stop right there. Read that list again. Someone is missing. The 5th son is gone. Out of the original 12 men standing around that deathbed in Goshen, only 11 make it into the final eschatological registry. The tribe of Dan is completely erased from the book of Revelation. Sit with that. The name that literally meant judge is not allowed to enter the final courtroom of the earth. The bloodline that agreed to harbor the Shephaphon, the ancient venom of Beliar, is mathematically and deliberately cut out of the final remnant of humanity. Jacob's terrifying deathbed vision was entirely accurate. The adversary planted a seed inside the camp, assuming he could conquer the nation from within. But the ultimate authority, the rider of the white horse in Revelation, ensures that the viper does not survive the final strike. I hold this as one reading, a careful bridge spanning from a deathbed in Genesis to an island vision on Patmos. I am not handing you final doctrine on every individual soul ever born to that bloodline, but the textual silence of Revelation 7 is deafening. We know why the old man broke his prophecy to cry out for the Yeshua. We know why the 5th son was completely erased from the end of the world. But exactly how the ancient serpent intends to use the forgotten, scattered remnants of that bloodline in the darkest hours before the final curtain falls, the text does not say. The desert is still holding the rest. If you tracked with me all the way to the end of this timeline, comment the word "watched" below. Subscribe to the channel because there are dozens of these canonical mysteries waiting in the dust. And send this to exactly one person who loves biblical prophecy but has never heard the dark inheritance of the 5th son. The viper still waits by the path, but the heel has already won.